Hey guys, Brent Campbell again. Today I'm following up with you on the last two videos I published about my 6+ years of owning my M5, where first in part 1 I spoke of the platform's history and why it's so special, followed by part 2 where I discussed the quirks of the E60. Today is part 3, the actual costs and work done going back to 2011. So now we arrive at the part I think you guys were probably waiting for most, which is the cost of ownership over the time that I've owned the car. And as it happens, as my brother owned the car. So it's a total of 9+ years. I've owned it for a little bit over 6. So like I was saying, I've got the history on the repairs on the car going back to the year 2011. And in that time, my brother didn't have many issues. He replaced the tires and the brakes and things like that, but very little. And that's typical for a newer car. By the time I got it, it had some miles on it, so things were due to be replaced. So some of the common issues that I have addressed include the throttle body actuators, of course, the rod bearings, which I just did a video about, the brakes, the ABS module, which I probably should do a video about, the oil cooler, ignition coils, which I just replaced, and then frequent tire and oil changes. And like I said before, never leave home without a quart of 10W60 in your trunk. My brother bought the car in September 2011, one of 1,364 with his 6-speed manual made. He had searched high and low to find it. And as he also had wanted one that was black on black. He named it Jules, from Pulp Fiction. And this is when he called me up. I remember this conversation like it was yesterday. My wife and I were strolling our baby, now a preteen, just past Northern Boulevard to a rented garage space in Queens. And he told me he'd bought the M5, and that if I wanted his M3, I needed to come get it, stat. So I promptly booked my flight, packed my checkbook, and my life's never been the same. Anyway, when my brother bought the M5, it had 23,000 miles on it, and he got it from a dealer in Atlanta. Apparently, the first owner had lived in Manhattan. What anyone would do with a manual M5 in Manhattan beats me, but I can see it blasting off to the Hamptons or wherever on the weekends and serving that purpose well. I just think it's funny that it actually ended up back in New York. Anyway, the car was in great shape and little work needed to be done on it, if any actually, though David wanted to make it look a little bit more sporty as it had the wood trim in it. So he commissioned some carbon fiber trim for the interior, and an audiophile, he decided to upgrade the stereo system significantly. 2012, he got a new battery, which is a common maintenance issue that's way more expensive on the M5 than a typical car. To give you an idea, I bought a battery 5 years later for $462, and the price was consistent for what he paid for his. It's a huge battery, and my mechanic tells me that the car has 70 computers keeping all the systems and sensors running, which is why you must plug it into a battery tender if you don't drive it every day. Otherwise, the system drains the battery. I may be repeating myself, but I've had a dead battery 3 times after letting the car sit just for a few days. Never again. While it was stunning to look at, and still is, sadly, the carbon fiber has not aged well. After about a year, the bits started to come loose. Then, a few years later, I was driving my daughter to school on a 5-degree February morning. After a cold and slow start, the carbon fiber wheel began cracking in my hands. It doesn't bother me much, and it surely isn't worth another $1,600 or whatever it would cost to replace it. But I do need to deal with it. I figure I'll do a video on it, so please do stay tuned on that. Anyway, in 2013, more maintenance was done. Brakes on the M5 aren't cheap. They're designed to stop a 4,000-pound car going 3-digit speeds with authority, after all. To give an example, a rotor on the M5 is $400 and change. On a typical car, you're going to pay about $80. 2014. When my brother took delivery of his new secure orange M4, he placed another call to me, following one 3 years prior to that, asking me if I wanted to take the M3. I'd been planning on it, scrimping and saving, making cuts on extras, and then I took out a low-interest loan, and then proudly drove back to New York in the coolest 4-door ever, in my opinion at least. At 44,000 miles, the car was in pristine condition and barely broken in. I knew then, as I know now, that they may make them shinier, faster, and with better gadgets, but they never make one better or so special ever again. And they definitely never make another one with a high revving V10. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. And I was surrounded by people who had no clue what this M5 and M3 nonsense was anyway. And they looked at me like I had three heads when I talked about why I was so excited. And then it occurred to me one day that I could just go on YouTube, find people like me. I'm telling you now, it was an outlet that I desperately needed to have. 2015, after a spirited drive and road trip to the Berkshire Mountains in northwestern Massachusetts, I published a couple videos driving up this mostly empty mountain road.
3,491 feet, here we are.
Which I'll link to here. And when we returned to New York, I learned that the oil cooler was leaking and needed to be replaced. Whoops. I hadn't yet learned that this was a common issue on these cars, but I suppose I got lucky, discovering the issue before it became catastrophic. You know, like when I was screaming up that mountain road 150 miles from my trusted mechanic. Then, in fall 2016, after returning from our 4,000 or so mile road trip to see family, the car started alerting me to issues with the ABS system. With a little digging, we learned that the ABS module was beginning to fail. Dealing with this is, I believe, an issue that affects all E60 M5s eventually. Maybe this has something to do with its placement behind the driver's side front wheel. In the regular E60, it's up above and near the engine. But because the V10 is so big, the engineers decided to put the unit off to the side, which leads to these issues, since this placement makes it vulnerable to the elements. So that was a painful price to pay. Even the reconditioned unit at a third the price of a new OEM part. I'll have you know that I drive the car a lot less in the rain now. Then I had to replace the front brakes. I already spoke to this when I was talking about 2013. They're amazing brakes for what was a $100,000 car new. It should go without saying that they're going to be pricey to replace. I've heard tales of other cars where, it's way more insane. Again, just because the car is cheap to buy at the bottom of its depreciation curve doesn't mean that it's going to be cheap to maintain. In 2017, predictably, I got new tires because the car burns through rear tires twice as fast as the fronts, which is really just a side effect of having rear-wheel drive, 500 horsepower, and sometimes using it. The rears wear fat and grippy 285/35 ZR19s, which are awesome, but you gotta pay. Then, in summer 2018, I started the car up, got a big warning light on the dash, alerting me that the car had gone into limp mode. And limp mode is a thing to experience. For comparison, the slowest car I've ever driven was a 69 VW bus with a 3-speed automatic transmission. In limp mode, the M5 is slower. It's trying to prevent you from destroying it after all. I took it to my mechanic and everything checked out though. A few months later, 1,400 miles away in Georgia, it happened again. Luckily, I was able to get it to the dealer to have them take a look. They ran the diagnostic, and sure enough, one of the throttle body actuators was about to fail, and the car was warning me. I'd researched the cost of parts online, saw that the dealer's bid was alarmingly high. I was in a rush to get to my dad's place in Oklahoma, and so I rolled the dice, asked them to clear the codes and patch the car up, and we took it easy driving to Oklahoma. It was like 1,000 miles or so. Luckily, the car performed without issue, and we were able to get it to my dad's garage for a couple of weeks so we could do the necessary surgery. And by we, I mean Wes Vreeland did the work. While I watched and listened to him, it was fascinating, and I gained a whole new appreciation for the car and its engine. I talked about this in part 2, and then I made an 11-minute video about replacing the throttle body actuators at the time. Truly, it was the best bonding experience I've had with the car, and I was able to get in and get a good look at the guts of the thing, and to appreciate just how fantastically overbuilt it is, to reliably handle the demands it was designed to handle. In 2019, approaching a 4,000-mile road trip with my family along, the odometer was fast approaching 75,000 miles, and, well, I didn't want to take any chances. So I pulled the trigger on fixing an issue I wouldn't ever sense until it was too late. And this car's reputation is littered with tales of these special and very expensive to replace engines imploding due to the tight tolerances and the thick motor oil wearing the rod bearings out prematurely. I took it to JC Auto. Well, actually, no, I had it towed, and they got me fixed up. While they were in there, they also replaced the engine mounts, power steering that was about to go, and the starter, which had failed the day I was taking the car in to do the work. And, well, you can read the rest of the list here. I made an 11-minute video about that too, which I'll also link to. Now we're on to this past year, 2020. One afternoon, I fired up the car to go run an errand, cold start, and the engine didn't sound right. It was running lumpy. I drove it a few blocks and then, boom, it switched into limp mode. I immediately drove it to my mechanic. They ran the diagnostic and, no surprise, multiple ignition coils had failed. So we replaced all 10. But then I got new tires, which took some of the pain away. Okay, now we're all caught up. Now on to the analysis. In general, the M5 cost about twice as much to maintain as my E60 M3. So that's what, 4 to 5 times what a normal car costs to maintain? Still, it's cheap for what it is. It's less than $25,000 over the 6 years that I've owned it. Though I don't think it's best to look at it that way. When you buy a car like this, you've got to consider the arc of time and what parts will need to be replaced over that time. In the case of this car, it's the rod bearings, it's the oil cooler, Vanos, ABS module, the ignition coils, engine mounts, the SMG transmission if you have it, though on my M3 I've had 0 issues with my SMG. And then you got the tires and the brakes, the synthetic oil. So you have a higher cost to maintaining all the different aspects of the car. It's expensive, but again, for what it is, it's not expensive at all. My mechanic pulled me aside a few years back to show me a Ferrari F355 that they were working on at the time. They were fixing the transmission. Absolutely gorgeous car. But the maintenance, it's on another plane compared to M cars. That transmission was going to cost, 5 figures as opposed to 4 figures. You've got to pay to play. And so as long as you enter with eyes wide open and buy the best loved, the best maintained one you can find, you have no reason to fear. So what did I learn from this analysis? What didn't surprise me, I spent at least a third more maintaining the M5 in the 6 years I've owned it than I have on the M3 in my 9 years of owning it. Yeah, so what did surprise me? The maintenance costs aren't as bad as they're made out to be when you consider depreciation, especially compared to a new one. Depreciation on the M5, its first 5 years was about $11,000 per year. It cost about $100,000 new, and my brother paid $50,000 and change to buy it when it was 5 years old. Is that right? 2008? When it was 3 years old. So 2008, and he bought it in 2011. Wow. The first owner lost about $50,000 on it, and then my brother bought it 3 years later. So that's like $17,000 per year the first 3 years. Then my brother bought it, and he lost about $20,000 in the 3 years that he owned it, or about $7,000 per year. Since I bought it 6 years ago, I've spent less than $25,000 on repairs and about $10,000 or so on depreciation, where I've lost $10,000 to depreciation. So all in, I've lost about the same as he did over twice as much time. So with that in mind, the M3 was a better financial decision. Though there's a chance that the M5 may also increase in value, as its reputation has been hit by the tales of its high maintenance costs that aren't entirely fair, and time may change people's minds, given how insane that engine really is, and that nothing like it will ever be made again. That, and they only made about 1,300 of them with a stick. I figure fewer than half of them are left at this point, and their rarity may drive a spike in value. Now, with regards to depreciation, allow me to elaborate here. A new 2021 M5 competition cost about $112,000. In 6 years, it'll be worth $60,000 or less. Depreciation for the new model will be about $60,000 over 6 years, or about $10,000 per year. Yikes. I bought my E60 6 years ago for $34,000. It's now worth about $25,000, give or take. In 6 years, depreciation has cost me $9,000 or about $1,500 per year. If I'm averaging less than $4,000 per year in repairs that are largely preventative and tasks that I can plan for, sure, it's costing me that money, but the car is now likely at the bottom of its depreciation curve and about to swing back up when you consider the rarity and specialness of this car. And I've put nearly 40,000 miles on the car in that time. And most of those were highway miles, which is where the M5 readily shines. Don't get me wrong, it's still expensive. I want to be clear about that. But the way I look at it, I'm driving an M5 with a 5-liter V10 that'll go over 200 miles an hour. It's hard not to expect it to be expensive to maintain. What's next for me to do on this car? Well, I've got to address the cracked carbon fiber trim. There's a side grille that is wearing down, the trunk lid M badge, perhaps getting a new gear shift lever too. And then there's the cracked rubber around the front windshield. Also, I want to make sure to get both the M5 and the M3 insured through Hagerty at a market instead of Kelley Blue Book value, so I can get its replacement value back for this truly rare car in the event that something bad happens. I'll need to take care of the rear brakes and the spring. And otherwise, with new tires and newish throttle body actuators and rod bearings, I should be solid for a few years. Something that's nice to see with these cars. And then what's next about the M5 on the YouTube channel? I'm thinking about doing an overview of the M5's heritage, which I think are best and why. It might take a while to properly produce such a video, so I may create, say, an ignition coil replacement video first. As always, if there's anything you want to hear from me, please suggest it in the comments, and I'll absolutely consider if I can make it work.
Here we go.